right, good morning and welcome to another segment of the Newstalk WTIM Morning Show, heard here on the Big 870 AM, Newstalk WTIM, also 96.1 FM in Christian County and 107.5 FM in Shelby County. Our guest for this segment, joining us in studio, someone I'm very excited to have in studio here, State Senator Andy Manar. State Senator Manar, thanks so much for coming on in this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And it's a pleasure to have you in here, and we were kind of talking here before we went on air. This is the first time in my entire time of living here in Illinois we've had a full state budget. So how did it happen? How did we, I know it's been a lot of work over the last couple of years. How did it all get put together to where we could finally get one passed?
I would well, first of all, I would say that that's pretty sad, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think it's indicative of what we've been dealing with in Springfield for the past about 2.5 years. But to answer the question, I would rewind the clock to January of this year when the new General Assembly was sworn in. The Republican leader at the time, who has now since resigned her office, Christine Radogno, and the Senate President, John Cullerton, got together and said they wanted a bipartisan solution to the 2-year-old budget impasse. And they began the process of working together. And that begins with talking to each other, which doesn't happen enough in Springfield, which is why we haven't been able to break the impasse up until recently. The first thing that we did in the Senate was something that I think voters in the district I represent want, and that's to limit the terms of leaders in the General Assembly. So we did that in the Senate as the very first step that we took. That was a overwhelmingly bipartisan vote, and that set the stage for what eventually, almost 8 months later, became a complete and balanced budget that was supported by not everyone in both parties, but members of the House and the Senate of both parties in Springfield.
Yeah, and there has been some critics for this budget, but there's enough support for it to where you could override a veto, and that's another thing too. It originally passed through the Senate and the House, got to the governor's desk, he said no, went back to the General Assembly, and you guys overrode the veto. So how did you get? Was there just enough support there in general to override that veto, or was it something you had to work on?
We had to work on it, but I think that improved the final product. Having competing voices and individual members of the Senate from both sides of the aisle critiquing the product, I think made it better along the way. We were able to achieve an override, which I was disappointed the governor vetoed the budget package. It was a tough vote, toughest vote I've ever taken in my short time in the state Senate. But we were able to override the veto because it was a disciplined and a conservative budget framework. It spent $3 billion less than what we would be spending without a budget this fiscal year. It spent less money than what the governor himself suggested that we spend when he produced his budget proposal back in February, which he was required to do. It doesn't create any new programs. It doesn't expand major programs in state government. It caps spending, and it raises the minimum level of revenue necessary to balance. All the while we prioritize school funding, which is the most important issue that we face today. So that's a pretty good set of principles. And without those things, I mean, if this was a budget that was, going to expand Medicaid or, expand programs or create new things in the state budget that, frankly, we don't need, it would have neither have received the majority vote to pass and certainly would not have received the supermajority vote necessary to override the governor's veto. So it was disciplined.
Yeah, and it seemed to me like there was enough with this budget that was, things that both sides had been asking for, that it really seemed to help get that, push that through. Let's talk a bit about the budget itself, kind of get into some of the more details. What are some features, or I guess you could say, of this budget that you're particularly proud of and glad that's in there?
So I would start with one that is probably the answer you weren't expecting, because it's the one that's reported on the least, but I think it's the most important. This budget stops the hemorrhaging of spending hundreds of millions of dollars more than what we have every month. I think the largest kind of misunderstanding of the last 2 years is that most voters think and most citizens think that without a budget, we aren't spending money, and it's exactly opposite of that. Without a budget, we are, as a state under the Rauner administration, have been spending money wildly to the tune of about $600 million more every month than we bring in revenue, which is unsustainable, right? That's hemorrhaging of money and hemorrhaging of the state's finances. So that stops immediately. So there are spending constraints that are put in place right now today that are a far cry from where we were just 2 weeks ago. So that's number one. We stop the hemorrhaging of overspending. That's what the budget that we passed and overrode the veto on does, first and foremost. Again, it doesn't create any new programs. It pays off a pretty good chunk of the $15 billion of backlog of bills that we face today, which was accrued over the course of 2.5 years. But within the spending, it also prioritizes spending for K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade public schools. And it prioritizes that money not in the broken system, but in the new system that we are also proposing, so that underfunded downstate districts are at the front of the line for that money. So I think it's important to note that we don't say, let's go spend, in this case, $350 billion more on schools by just spending money we don't have. We fit that into a balanced budget, and that's a change in behavior in Springfield. It's one that I've advocated for in my short time in the Senate. We can't spend more than we have, and we have to prioritize schools. So within that framework, again, a tough set of decisions, and I don't dismiss what it took to get that done, because nobody wants to pay more taxes, including myself. But we have to change the financial structure of the state. We have to right this ship, and I think this budget gets the job done.
Indeed, and I know the comptroller's office seemed to be particularly happy about those spending limits put into place. Is there anything with this budget that you think maybe we could look to do a little better in the future?
Well, we, as I mentioned earlier, the budget doesn't pay off the $15 billion in unpaid bills, but it does pay off about half of that, maybe a little bit less than half of that, while capping spending and staying in balance. So I think that's a challenge for us immediately, is how do we tackle that other $8 billion, $7 billion in backlog of bills so that we can pay off vendors while not spending more than what we have. So we don't want to pay off billions of dollars of unpaid bills and then accrue more.
Right.
That would be a huge mistake, and we're not going to do that. So I think that's one challenge. I think the other challenge is we want to make sure that the cuts that were made to bureaucracy in state government, which was 5% across the board, which amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars, don't cut too deep. For example, we didn't take a sledgehammer to agencies like the Department of Children and Family Services because, by all accounts, they are wildly understaffed today, to the point where federal courts are now stepping in to protect children who are wards of the state. So we want to make sure that those cuts don't go too deep that would end up costing us more money in the long run. I think those are two things. And then, of course, the most immediate piece is school funding. We want schools to open on time. We want them to have full funding, and we want that funding to be prioritized to downstate underfunded districts.
And I want to dive more into school funding reform. We'll do that here in a little bit. First, though, I know one common thing that seems to be said among many people, just that I hear from the community and online throughout the state, is those tax increases. I know it's never a popular thing, but personally, I kind of fall in the camp to where I'm okay with a tax increase if I know that money is going to be spent responsibly. How do Illinois taxpayers know that, okay, well, you're handing a little bit more money over to the state, but that money is going to be spent responsibly, and we're not going to be down here in another year, 2, 3, 4 years in the same boat that we've been in for the past couple?
That's a good question, probably the most important question, I think, in this whole debate. So here's my answer. If this budget would have spent more money, I would not have been voting for it. It spends $3 billion less than what we otherwise would have spent, also spends less than what the governor himself, the self-proclaimed fiscal conservative who's running the state of Illinois, asked us to give him. So we are giving him less than he asked for because we wanted to make sure that if we are going to raise revenue, that it's done in the right way and it's not used on things that we don't need, creating new programs that we can't afford. That's not part of this budget scenario. And also, here's what we didn't do. People talked about a soda tax, which I opposed. We didn't do that. People talked about a service tax, which in some instances could be done correctly, but I don't think we were ready to do that because that needs more study. So that's not in this budget. We didn't tax retirement income, which is an exemption in the state of Illinois. Wild opposition to that. That's not part of this. At the end of the day, we put the tax rate below where it was in 2014 when Pat Quinn was governor, which of course expired, which ended up ballooning the unpaid bills and put us kind of in this fiscal abyss that was, pretty darn near close junk status, one day from being junk status. So, this budget doesn't spend money wildly. It's a reduction in spending without question. And I think, again, that's what earned bipartisan support and eventually the override of the governor's veto.
We had mentioned school funding reform. I want to talk to you more about that and SB1 when we return here on this segment of the News Talk WTIM Morning Show, streamed online at TaylorvilleDailyNews.com.